into new material. Yesterday we started to look directly at grammar. We've covered the sound system in writing pretty well, although I'll be coming back to that from time to time as we move along. But we're now beginning to look at the grammar of the language, not how you pronounce words, but how you make words up, how you build words up from smaller elements or smaller units like stems and suffixes, and how you put words together to form proper sentences. So grammar has to do with the rules for making words up. Another technical word for the study of how words are built up or words are composed is morphology. And another word for the rules that we use for combining words to make up proper sentences is syntax. Syntax. And I want in the succeeding lectures to give you a pretty good, to run through morphology and syntax, or the morphology and syntax. So I'll get in some detail, but right now I'm trying to give just a bit of an overview, to you, particularly of morphology, but also of syntax. I also introduced you to the notion of grammatical categories. Grammatical categories, I'll put it into the singular there, which are the significant or the important kinds of meanings that are marked in the language. And I think I mentioned that while languages differ in their grammars from one to the other, that quite often we find the same kinds of grammatical categories across languages. The category of number, of singular versus plural, is a category that is found in many, many languages of the world. Some languages will take it even further than that and will distinguish between singular, dual, and plural. So that, for example, in Sahaptin, the language that I've worked in down in Oregon, they make a distinction between singular number, dual number, and then plural, which means three or more. So that one man, if you want to say one man, it's just a winch. But if you're talking about two men, you have to refer to them, speak of them as being a winching, where the "in" marks dual number. And if you speak of three or more men, they are a winchma. And the same works for other kinds of human beings. Like a woman is tilaki, tilakin, two women, tilakima, three or more women. So in that language it has singular and plural number, but it also has a dual number. And there's a language spoken up in Torres Strait, the language of the people who just won the Mabo case, which is the big major land rights case in Australia. In their language, sometimes you have singular number, dual number, and then what's called trial number. Trial in the sense of three. It actually means several, and then there's another plural. So there's one way of saying one man, two men, three or four, just a few men, and then, lots of men. It has four different number categories. For our Smalgit, though, we'll see that the major distinction is between singular and plural. But as we go into the plurals today, we'll see there it's not really just more than one, but that the plural category in symbolic is a bit more differentiated than that, a bit more complex, and we'll explore that a bit together. I'll also introduce the notion of grammatical process. Grammatical process, which grammatical processes are the formal means by which a language marks its categories. We've just seen here in this language, which is called Sahaptin, the language spoken by the Yakima and Umatilla, Warm Springs, Palouse, by a number of different people. The category of singular, well, of dual and plural number is marked by suffixation. And then I moved on to tell you that in human languages, across the great range of human languages, there are basically 6 kinds of grammatical processes that we find. And in Symbolic, we'll find that all 6 of these processes are used, but there is affixation, ablaut, compounding, suppletion, selection, and order. And it's important now to begin to understand these. I'll review them again and move on through them, the rest of them with you. But it's important to begin to learn these and what they are, because as we go on and we want to look at the grammar, these are concepts that help us to organize and interpret what we've written down or what we hear. It's, in many ways, you can think of what I'm giving you in here with respect to your language is a new set of glasses. If I keep telling you, we need to stand back from the language and look at it to see how it works. And part of that is, to write it down where we represent it on paper or on the blackboard as a system of, as a series of vowels and consonants, just like musical notes. But I'm also giving you a new set of glasses with a new prescription where when you look at a word, you look at it and you see, oh, there's a stem, there's a suffix. Oh, it's got reduplication in its plural prefix there. Or, oh, that particular set of forms are related by what we call suppletion, which I haven't yet spoken about today. But so I'm giving you a new set of lenses to look at it, but I wouldn't want you to think that you need to wear those linguistic eyeglasses 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Life would perhaps grow a bit boring or colorless to you. And I'd have to tell you that I take my linguistic glasses off quite a few hours of the day, too, to get on with life. But affixation involves, well, can involve either prefixation or suffixation, where affixation involves affixes, which are bound forms, that is, forms that cannot stand by themselves, and a prefix is simply a bound form that is attached to or bound to a stem, to the beginning of a stem. A suffix is a bound form that is bound to or occurs at the end of a stem. And quite often you can have several prefixes pile up in forming complex words. Similarly, you can have several suffixes. If you take the English word ungentlemanliness, there you can see it's got one prefix, but it's got a number of suffixes on it. And it also involves compounding. And I was telling you about another kind well, prefixation and suffixation. I gave you some forms with the prefix ha, which means an instrument, but there's another prefix which is very common in Somalia, which is an, which when you prefix it to an intransitive verb stem, I won't define that right now, but to an intransitive verb or intransitive verb seam or stem, it gives you a new noun that basically means the place where you perform that activity. So, for example, at, to fish with nets, if you prefix un to it, an at, as in ka'an at dit, it means the place where people perform that activity of fishing with a net. Sinoon or sinon, to go for salmon, if you prefix un to that, as in unsinundit, some people might want to use an O there, unsinundit. Unsinundit is a place where you go to get salmon. A place where people do foot races or run, unqol. And sometimes in place names, you find that prefix un following the compounding form git. So, for example, git unmax, where they fish with birch bark torches or use max, birch bark torches, or git ungualc. Ungualc is a place where it's dry, so the git ungualc are the people who live at or from the place that is dry.
You had a place where we fished fishing camp this time at the airport called En Bolton. En Bolton.
En Bolton. Okay. But I'm glad you gave me that form, Art, because in Western Gitksan it's not un but en, E-N. You know, short E in Western Gitksan generally corresponds to short ah. And I'll write it this way, Unqol Hun, which would be where the salmon run or move quickly. Reduplication is another kind of prefixation, but it's where the prefix doesn't have a constant shape. Like notice an or n always stays the same no matter what we put after it. Or ha always stays the same. Whereas with reduplication, the shape, that is the sound of the prefix, is like a chameleon. It takes on some of the features of the shape of the stem. So we have zup, and the plural of zup or zap, zip zap, zip zap. Reduplication. I gave some, moving on to the next grammatical process. The next grammatical process, which is ablaut. Ablaut, which involves changing a vowel or changing a consonant or maybe changing both. And it's not a really common process in Somalia, but it occurs quite frequently. We gave the example yesterday of gesh, to stab, pierce, stick, and gitse, a design. Another example of ablaut, a new one, the verb in Western Gitksan, gibeh, means to wait for somebody, just using it without any suffixes on it, gibeh. And if you compare that with the longer form, gibes, which means also to wait on somebody, but it has a slightly different meaning. I don't want to try to explore that with you right now, but notice here we have the shorty, gibeh, as in yuk nigiben, I'm waiting for you, as opposed to yuk gibes hui lon or hasnin. Again, a similar sort of meaning, but slightly different. But notice how the short E here in the simple form, in this more complex form, we have this suffix SXW, which we'll call antipassive later. But here we have a long vowel followed by a glottal stop and short vowel. Gibeh, not gibes, but gibes. It's a case of ablaut, where to form a new category or to signal, a new category, slight difference of meaning, that we use ablaut to do it. Okay, now back to where I was when I left you yesterday. I had just, on this material, I had just begun to talk to you about compounding. And as I said, compounding is a grammatical process that's very frequent in English. We use it to form new words, but compounding is where you take what generally are two independent words, two free forms, combine them, you put them together, you attach them to one another, and form a new word, a new single word. And in English, typically when you do that, you change the stress pattern so that English compounds have the stress on the first element, primary stress on the first element, and the secondary stress on the second element. To give you an example, I can talk about a White House. So-and-so lives in a White House. In a White House, no, Bush doesn't live there anymore, not for long. But he doesn't live in a White House. He lives in the compound, which is, I'll capitalize it here, and write it as two words, but it's actually pronounced as a single word. Bush lives in the White House. See, White House, he lives in a White House, which is adjective plus a noun. When we put that adjective plus a noun together to form a compound, the stress shifts, we get White House, and it also has a slightly more specialized meaning. The White House is not just any White House, but it's a particular White House. It's a specific one. Now, similarly, compounding is used in to a considerable extent. Sometimes the new compound word has a slightly more specialized meaning than, simply the sum of the two words that are put together. But sometimes it simply has the meaning, the sum, the combined meaning of the two words that have been put together. Now, in talking about compounds in English, we need to talk about at least 3 different kinds of compounds. What I yesterday called the blackbird type of compound. The blackbird type of compound where you can look at the 2 elements, black and bird, and the meaning of blackbird is quite similar to that of blackbird. A blackbird is one kind of blackbird. And crows are blackbirds too, but we don't call them blackbirds. Then there's a second kind of compound in English which is illustrated by this word cranberry, where for most people, we know what a berry is because we have blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, all different kinds of berries, but what's a cran? It doesn't make sense to us. But if you take a course in the history of English or look up an English dictionary that gives historical information, like there is the Oxford Dictionary organized on historical principles, which will tell you when a word came into the language, or at least when the first written occurrence of the word, what the first written occurrence that's recorded is. And you'll find out that cranberry comes originally from a Middle English form that meant craneberry. So cranberries were the berries, presumably, that cranes ate. So there's a relationship. In modern English, we pronounce crane like this, as crane, but when it occurs in the compound cranberry, we pronounce it as cran. But anyway, in the cranberry type of compounds, one of the elements, the second element, is, words that occur in the everyday language, but the first element is slightly different from the related word in the everyday language. The third kind of compound is what I call the eventide compound. And there are this set of words in English like eventide and yuletide, and I still haven't thought. I know there's at least one more there, where even obviously has something to do with evening, but where tide doesn't have to do with the tide that comes in and out, but it means time, and in fact is the old word for time. Well, what's important here is that one element in the compound, just happens to be the second element of the compound, is quite different from the equivalent word, the equivalent independent word in the everyday language. We normally say time now rather than tide because we've replaced the older word teed, which would have become tide in modern English. And we'll see there are such words, lots of eventide compounds in some Algic. The other point, before I start giving examples, is that typically not typically, but always in some Algic, the stress on a compound word, the primary stress is on the second element, and the first element has the secondary stress if there's a vowel there. So that I gave the example yesterday, the family name normally pronounced in English is Blackwater. Many people, or older people, will pronounce that name with the Algic stress pattern as Blackwater, Blackwater, or instead of courthouse, courthouse, where that's part of speaking English with a Algic accent where you carry, the stressing rule over into English. Well, there are lots of blackbird-type compounds in Algic. To give an example, the word wilp, house, compounds quite freely with other words of the language to form new words. So wilp you can compound with habas. So wilp habas, whereas secondary stress, primary stress, it's not wilp habas, which would be pronouncing it in an English type way, but wilp habas is a barn or a hay shed. It's a structure for storing habas, or hay. I won't repeat these, but wilplak is what? Lak by itself is wood or fuel, so wilplak is a woodshed. Not a house made of wood, but a house for wood, for storing wood. Lietligit, feast. Now, notice how I've written it here, lietligit. If I left this off right here and just wrote lietligit, I would be pronouncing it in the Siwa type way. It wouldn't be correct, but it's a hard L. Lietligit, compounded with wilp lietligit. Not wilp lietligit, but wilp lietligit. Secondary stress, then you hit the primary stress. You can also compound it with other types of words, like a verb here, sahun or sahon, wilp sahun, which would be what? Smokehouse, or place for preparing, place for making,
Our elders don't like it when the young people say smokehouse. It's not where you go and smoke.
That's a good place because, you see, by using smokehouse, which is the English way of describing the house as, where you smoke fish, that the Algic actually, sahun, is not just smoking, but it's the whole process of drying and preparing. What sahun? So, and then lastly, take this verb one, which means to sit, and one, as in one should get, is a plural form. It means for more than one person to sit. But what is a wilp one? What's the wilp one in the house?
Living in.
The living room. So wilp is not just strictly a house, but it also can have the meaning of a room or a space, and I suppose something perhaps like an enclosed space where an activity is performed. See if I've got this right. Now, we've been making up compounds using wilp as the first element in a compound, but wilp can be compounded with others. There is a word sto, which means side, and you can talk about the sto wilp, which would be the actual physical side of a house. But if we take sto by itself and compound it with wilp, sto wilp, what does that mean? A sto wilp, is it really a side of a house, the physical side? I think it has a bit more specialized meaning. It would be one of the groups of, one of the families who are part of a whelp. So it's what an anthropologist might, if you were writing it down, would call it the side of a house, but would write it with a capital S and a capital H to indicate that it has this more specialized meaning. It's a social group, not the literal one. How about mean whelp? Mean whelp, where we have mean, which is an independent noun by itself, which means, you know, like the foot of a mountain, the base of a tree. Boss, or Lord, meanim, our Lord. But if you compound it, mean whelp, it would be the head of the house. And again, we might, if we write it in English, we might translate it in this way, with capital H and capital H there. And again, whelp in this case doesn't mean a physical structure, but it means the house group. Just as in English, you can talk about, say, the House of Windsor, you know, the English royal family, the British royal family. You don't mean Windsor Castle. The Windsor Castle is not the House of Windsor. But when we use house in that sense, we mean the social grouping, you know, the family, the royal family. Similarly, in this case, mean whelp. Whelp has the meaning of, you know, the social group of people who belong to the same house, and in the old days perhaps lived in the same physical structure. Compounds, lots of them in some algae, and you would want to put these into a dictionary because they are conventionalized, they are customary forms of the language. They're not simply forms that we make up on the spur of the moment. So these compounds with whelp are examples of blackbird-type compounds where you can look at both elements of the compound and they occur as independent forms in the language. In cranberry-type compounds, one element, and in this case the first element, and this will be true in some algae too, the first element is similar to the independent word, but will generally involve some ablaut, you know, that the vowel is a bit different. A good example of a cranberry-type compound is your name for yourself. Here in western Gitksan, the Skeena River is Gitksan. In eastern, Gitksan, and Gitksan. Now, notice that the people of the Skeena River in western are the Gitksan, secondary stress, primary stress, Gitksan, and in eastern, Gitksan, not Gitksan, but Gitksan, where you have the primary stress. Stress, by the way, means, well, basically it's the loudest syllable. The primary stressed syllable or the primary stressed vowel is the loudest vowel. It has the greatest amount of energy, and within some algic words and phrases there will always be one primary stress. But notice how the git here is obviously related to get, man or person. man or person. But when you compound it, you don't say Gitksan, Gitksan, but you change the vowel from get or get to git. You change the vowel. You have ablating. Ablating. Let me take this a bit further because it's interesting the way this word git will change. I've put on the board forms like git unmax, where the git stays the same, but or git wingach, but the next village up the river, the village, the people who live in that village, notice, are Gitksan. Obviously, there's a git in here, but you wouldn't say git ziguksa or get ziguksa, but gitiguksa. Or similarly, gispayaks, not gitspayaks. Gispayaks, the people of the hiding place. Or Gitksan. Gitksan is the name for Nass River. Gitksan is the Nass River. The Niska, our people quite often call them the Gitksan. Gitksan, not Gitksan. What I'm trying to get across to you now is that the git prefix, as in Gitksan, the T will drop. The T will drop from it before another consonant. Before another consonant. Zigukla is the name of that, Gitksan mountain in English. Zigukla. Spayaks would be a place or an area, territory for hiding, and this refers back to the Adawach that tells about the founding of the village. Gitksan is simply the name that the Niskak use for we get, the tricksters, anthropologists and folklorists call it there. But these then are all cranberry type of compounds. I want to do one more with you just to that illustrates the same sort of process. The village, which in English is called Kiskagas, it's spelled in English like this, but sometimes you see it written like this, Kisagas. And I often wondered why there were two ways of writing it in English. Now, when I first learned the name, I learned it as Gitksan. Where some old people told me, well, ka'as is a really old word that means small white gulls. And ska by itself normally means, like to block, to be in the way. But then when I was here the last time in 1986 and met Alice for the first time, she pointed out to me that she pronounces the name as Gitksan. Gitksan, where you see you have ska here and S glottal stop A, Gitksan. But you notice the git, the T comes off the git right there. And I'm doing just a bit, I'm talking about a bit more than compounding now, but trying to analyze place and people names because they're extremely important parts of the language. Most of you, well, everybody would know the form that's normally used for the fireweed clan or tribe, Gitksan. And some of you might know there's a place here on the river, I think it's up here, is it Giskoix or Skoix? Just up the river. I think I've got it. Hmm? Okay, we're hearing it two ways right here, like this. Something like that. Okay, what I'm trying to get at here we know that fireweed is normally called hast, and we can ask, what's the meaning of this ska right here? What's the meaning of the ska in giskast or giskahast, or giskahochs or giskochs? Well, it would appear that it means something like the place of, or the place where, you know, the place where there's small white gulls, the place where there is fireweed. Hochs, if I've got it, there is, what, is that maple or kind of tree? Balsam. So, people of the fireweed place, people of the place where there's small white gulls, but over time, sometimes, you know, ska simplifies to S-back-G-A, ska. Sometimes it loses the back-G part and just keeps the hard part, gis-a-kas. Now, that's a long digression into some names, and I won't, and actually this skakas, skahast, or skahast, and skahochs, those are the third kind of compound. But notice the gi right here is obviously a short form of git. It's reduced. The T comes out before a consonant or cluster of consonants. And the git is a different form. It's the compounding form of get, you know, the people of a particular place. These place names and names of people are extremely interesting in the language. Just by analyzing them, we can tell a lot about the history of the language. Okay, well, suppletion is, well, the eventide compound is what I want to get onto now, and it involves what is called suppletion. But remember, in the eventide kind of compound, one of the two elements is different from, it doesn't look like, doesn't sound like the corresponding independent word, the word that can occur independently by itself in the language. Let me give first And the definition, we can say that the eventide compounds involve the grammatical process of suppletion. That one of the elements that is compounded, the first element specifically, the first element that is compounded is in a relationship of suppletion to the equivalent independent word. Relationship of suppletion to the equivalent independent word. Now let me tell you what suppletion is, and we can go back and understand that. In English, most verbs most verbs have only a number of inflected forms, like take bake. I bake, you bake, she bakes. I baked, you baked, he baked, we baked, you guys baked, they baked. One past tense. I am baking, you are baking, and so forth. I have baked, I have baked. There's just a limited number of inflected forms. But there's one English verb which is extremely irregular, which doesn't behave, like 99% of the verbs in English. And that's this verb, to be, to be, to be. If it were regular, like bake, we would say, I be, you be, he bees, we be, you guys be, they be. And then I bead, you bead, and so forth. I am being, which is okay. I have been, although many people pronounce it as I have been. But when we start looking at the verb, it has many different forms. Not I be, but I am. You are, he or she or it is, and then you have simply are in the plural. We are, you guys are, they are, so forth. There. In the past tense, it's not I beed, but I was, you were, he or she was, we were, you guys were, they were. So was and were. And then in the participle forms, I am being, you are being, he is being, and so forth. They have just being. And then for the past participle, I say I have been. Australian English, I have been. What would be common in Canadian English? I have been or I have been? Been. Okay. Been, there. But notice how am doesn't look anything at all like be. Are doesn't look like be. Is doesn't look like be. Was and were look a little bit like each other, but they don't look like be. But yet we understand them as being related forms. They belong to what linguists call the same paradigm. A paradigm is a family of related forms. Now, for most verbs of the language, like bake, the paradigm is pretty regular. Bake, bakes, baked, baking, baked. Pretty regular. But the paradigm for be is irregular. It's be, am, are, is, are, and so forth. And in the past tense, it's was and were. Now, we say in linguistics that forms like am, are, is, was, and were are are in a relationship of suppletion to the form be. They're in a relationship of suppletion to the form be. They don't look anything like each other, but yet semantically, in terms of their meaning, we know that am is, it's the first person singular present tense of the verb to be. That is the third person singular present tense of the verb to be. By the way, this sort of irregularity is very, very old in the language, and you find similar sorts of irregularities in German and in most other Indo-European languages. English is not only a Germanic language, but it belongs to a large family of languages called Indo-European, which stretches before the Western Europeans began to colonize other parts of the world. It used to stretch from Ireland in the west all the way to Sri Lanka and the Maldive Islands in the southeast off the coast of India. But it's very old in the language. And just to carry this on a bit further, in places where people have taken English over and made it into new kinds of languages which are called pidgins and creoles, that they often get rid of all this irregularity and have just a single form. In fact, in the creoles that I know, there are no equivalent words to is, am, are, be, was, and were, but simply say I hungry or me hungry for I am hungry in the kind of Creole I speak. Or if you want to say them, they are running away, I simply say them runway. Means they are running away, where you just get rid of all the irregularities. Okay, well, suppletion then, you find in these eventide compounds, in the eventide type of compound, involves using words that are completely different from each other in their sound. Just realizing that I've put a section ahead of where I would have put it otherwise. I've been talking about compounding in great detail, whereas I really just wanted to, at this point, talk about it, but I'll go ahead and finish it. But the even-type compounds then involve suppletion. Just to give you an example, not of a compound, but of suppletion regularly in the language. Bach means to run, but is Bach one person or several persons or plural persons?
One.
It's one. What is the plural for Bach?
Good.
Kol. Okay, notice how Bach and Kol don't sound alike at all. They're just completely different.
Even full is the opposite thing.
They're in a relationship.
Bird to which one? Loon. That full is a name for loon.
For who?
Loon.
Loon, right. Kol is also the word for loon. Yeah. But see, you have singular and plural, and they don't look anything alike one another. They don't look alike each other at all. Okay, well, to come back then to the eventide type compounds, a good example would be if we take the independent verb goop, meaning to eat, and I wanted to say something like, I ate the bread. I ate the bread. I could say, Gubi's anash. Gubi's anash. Where goop changes, the P changes to a B before this vowel in the part that means the I. We have a sh here because it's a common noun following, and then anash. I ate the bread. Could I compound goop and anash? Goop anash ni? Goop anash ni? No. I have to say anash ni, anash ni, which means I ate some bread. Not the specific bread, but I ate some bread, or I ate bread, or I eat bread. But notice, so the anash right here is obviously the bread part. The ch is the part that means eat. But notice the ch doesn't look anything at all like goop. Doesn't sound like it. But yet we understand it as meaning eat. It's in a relationship of suppletion. So you can think of it this way. I'll use a proportional analogy for you. It's a good teaching trick, you know. In arithmetic we say 1 is to 2 as 2 is to 4. Okay. Am is to B as ch is to goop. Am is to B in English, you know, in a relationship of suppletion as ch is to goop. In other words, they have the same meaning, but they differ completely in sounds. To put this on the board, this little teaching strategy that I just used with you, I made use of what is called proportional analogy. It's a very powerful way of arranging material for learning. And, you know, you can think of a proportional analogy is, you know, 1 is to 2, as 2 is to 4, as 4 is to 8, and so forth. Well, I'll put it like this. Am is to be, in English, as ch is to goop. They're in a relationship of suppletion. Another example, so then anash is a verb that is formed by the grammatical process of compounding. It's also an intransitive verb. It's formed by compounding plus suppletion. By the way, these grammatical processes can go together in making up words. They're not mutually exclusive. If I eat meat, I could say, dim goobies smash, dim goobies smash, I'll eat the meat, or dim goobies smash tune, I'll eat this meat. But if I want to say just I'll eat some meat, I'm not specific about what meat I'm going to eat. Dim smash ni, dim smash ni, where you see smash contains smash, which, you know, is an independent word in the language, means meat or flesh. But the ch is the bound, B-O-U-N-D, it's the bound compounding form, of goop, to eat. There are also, I won't go into examples, but if you take, those compounds like with sin at the beginning, to go in order to get, as in sinhun, to go to get the salmon. Another kind of compound is do, dim do, something or other. Or how about demi smidas, or demi telis, where the he hears something, it means to go, it's obviously related suppletively to a verb like yeah, or so, to go. But you notice there's no independent words, he, or do, or sin. They always occur as the first member of a compound. And the second word that they get compounded with will occur as an independent word in the language.
Are we talking about eventide and compounding, or are we talking about eventide and deletion?
We're talking about both. Eventide we're using as a label now for a kind of compound, and the eventide compounds always involve suppletion. Now in English, the suppletion is between this bound form tide, which is the bound compounding form of time. So perhaps a better way of doing it is to say, here's the better analogy. Tide is to the independent word time. Tide and eventide is to the independent word time as ch in chanash is to the independent word goop in Somalia. That's the best way of using things. How does that sound, Alice? That make it more clear?
Because you were talking about suppletion, and then you went back to compounding, and I was wondering the words like sin and do and he.
Mm-hmm.
Does that refer to the both compound and suppletion?
Yes.
That's what I was asking.
Yes. See, compounding just generally involves putting two words together that normally occur as independent words to form a new word. But there are different kinds of compounds in English, and one of the kinds of compounds is where you take an independent word and put it together with a word that occurs only in compounds. So in other words, where it's in a relationship of suppletion to the independent word. Tide is in a suppletive relationship to time. Even time or evening time. Yule time, gives us the meaning of eventide and Yule tide. And similarly, ch, means to eat, but it just doesn't occur by itself. Sin, means to go, to get, but it doesn't occur by itself. How about do? Doesn't that also mean like to go to get something?
Do it.
Dim do anash. And he, which means to go, and it has more, it's like saying, I went to Terrace yesterday. Doesn't mean that you went there and stayed there, but you went there and came back. You completed your trip. But there's no independent words. Okay, compounding, and I'm sorry I've eaten into our coffee break. I'll come back and then I'll talk about suppletion again in a bit more detail. Well, it certainly is an extremely important grammatical process in Somalia, in that in order to speak the language correctly, or in describing the speech of people who speak it, one comes upon suppletion. You confronted. There are large numbers of verbs, but also of nouns, where the singular form and the plural form sound completely different, or where if they share any sound, it's just fortuitous. It's just it's just an accident. There are in the language, by my count, something like, well, between 30 and 50 at the most, pairs of suppletive verbs or suppletive nouns. And these are irregularities. From the standpoint of a language learner, these are things you have to learn specifically about the language. You can't learn a general rule and get the correct forms. It's like in English, you can learn the general rule for forming plurals, you know, like cat, cats, dog, dogs, bush, bushes. But when you try to generalize that rule and have man, mans, when it's in fact man, men, you'll make a mistake. Well, similarly in learning Smalgach or in writing a dictionary or a grammar of it, you have to recognize these basic fundamental irregularities at the phonetic level, but under, you know, at the level of meaning there is regularity. But we had, for example, the singular verb bach, meaning to run, move quickly. Its plural form, which is kol, which also happens to be a separate word in its own right, which means loon. Over, by the way, in the Skam, those two words are pronounced differently. Kol is to run, plural, but all is the loon. They kind of drag it out a bit. But they're pronounced the same our way here. Okay, the verb stem, which means to leave or go away, dimdaos, ni, dimdaos, ni. Short or long vowel, dimdaos or dimdaos. Long vowel, and what comes after it? A hard W, daos, dimdaos. Okay. Dim didaos nu. Sound right? No, no. What's the right way to say? Dim. Okay. In Western, dim sex nu, or in Eastern, dim sex nu. See, there's no relationship, no commonality of sound between the singular daos and the plural sex. To move to a noun right here, in Western Gitksan, spelt as G-E-T, get. Many people in Eastern Gitksan would pronounce the word the same way as G-E-T, get. But there are some people who have it as slightly different as get, not get, but get. But if we're using that in the sense of men, you know, male persons, what's the plural? There is a form, get, which means people, but if we want to say men, specifically men, e. Okay, that begins, is it short vowel or long vowel? Is it e-uch or e-uch? E-uch. Long vowel, hard W, e-uch, e-uch, and then in e-uch, e-uch. This is a word I suspect if I ask you to spell it yourselves that you would have great trouble spelling it initially, but if you sound it out to yourselves, just break it down. The first part is e-u, 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 e-u. where you can see there are three consonants. There's a hard W, there's an XW, you know, the blended sound, and a T. But notice, get, singular, and iucht, they don't look or sound at all like each other, but yet they are obviously related as singular to plural. In other words, Bach is to Paul as get is to iucht. They're using our notion of proportional analogy. How about if I tell somebody to get something? I say, goose, goose. But I'll use the bare stem right here, which is simply goo, goo, the bare stem, goose. Am I telling them to get one thing or more than one thing? One thing. But if I tell them, you know, get several things, what would I say? Doch. Go and doch. These are transitive verbs and they're not normally, they can be said independently, but normally you'd hear them with a sh at the end, which is marking the imperative, as in go and doch. Now notice, go and doch they don't look alike, you know, in the way they're written. The reason why they don't look alike is because they don't sound the same. Yes. Gosh. Okay, that's a gosh is a different verb. It's a different word. This one, you would have it as in haldem goos, you know, pick it up from the floor, but would you say haldem gosh? Could you say that? It doesn't sound quite right. It's a different verb, but it has much the same meaning. Isn't this specifically, you know, to get or pick something up, whereas this is go and get, fetch. And doesn't this have much the same meaning as soothe, yeah, go and get it, fetch it. But what's the plural of gosh? If we tell somebody, you know, could you say, gosh, abalon, go get your gun, fetch your gun? But how about if you wanted the plural of gosh?
He's at the bottom, and that's what she's trying to get out. It's
Dock. Okay. But these are separate words, and I won't bother with their plurals right now. Just do a few. Okay, let me ask about this pair. Zak, kill. Zak, dim zak di, ligiagu, I'll kill something, zak. And what's the plural of zak? Pardon? How about yets? Yets. Yes. Dem zak di, dem yets di. Now, actually, and see, there's no relationship when it's singular to plural. They don't sound alike, and thus they don't look alike. There are plural forms, like you can hisyets something, but hisyets means to do it, to perform the activity several times. Hisyets, I'll write it in the Western way with an E there, hisyets. And similarly, you can zuchzak, and I guess that would be what? To hit one thing several times? Zuchzak.
killed several times.
Yeah.
Or even we use it when we eat it.
What?
But second, just make you don't eat what you shoot right away. You gotta wait to eat it. Second. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and Zach in Western Gitksan, here's one of my favorite pairs of words: to flee, or to run away, or to escape. Let's try writing it. Does it begin with a K? K, and not glottal stop. It's not but it has the hard sound there. Now, is it or yeah? So it's the front one. Sounds like it has that Y blend on it, as though it's sort of like K hard Y there, or KY hard sound. And short vowel or long vowel? Yeah. Now, yeah. Okay, it has a soft back K, but what's at the end of it? The XW. It's a cluster of two consonants. K. And over on Gitksan, that is a chief's name. K. Well, they pronounce it as K. K. But it's the same word. Now, can I say dim gikek nu? No. What's the plural of keh? Dim hoot. Hoot. Again, notice no sound similarity whatsoever between the singular and the plural there. Another one, muck, to place something or to put it down, dimukdi. Now, can I say dim machdi or dim machdi? Dim tashdi. Tash or tash. Tash in Eastern Gitksan, to put or to place. Singular, to place or put one object, to place or put plural objects. And a word that's culturally quite important in Western Gitksan that has this same stem, tash, will not tash, will not tash, will not tash. Where if we begin to break it down, if we didn't know anything about the culture other than the language, we know that tash means for plural objects or people to be placed. Na gives us the idea of being, against the background or in plain sight. If we see somebody, yeah. It's, to see them come out of the woods where you can see them against the background, or if you open a tin can, a can, where you cut it open so it appears. Or the other day when Joan Ryan was here, we have that same na in her name, chief's name, which is like this, ha na mu, which describes the piercing of the ear piercing ceremony. But will not tash, those who are placed so as to be seen. But to give a translation of it into English, that's not adequate. It's always plural, but the people who sit together, at a feast, or the people who organize together, who cooperate as a unit? Come on, I'm asking you to help and translate.
It's a relationship or related to.
Okay. People who are related to each other. Now, are they the same clan? They all, you have, if you're in the same test, do you have to be all Lachyabu or Lachsehel or what? Okay, same clan. How about same wilt? Same house. So,
Has that got anything to do with na?
who? No. No, see, the na of who is just, you know, like natun is a soft N. It's not na, but no. So this is a separate word, this na by itself there. But anyway, this is a word that needs to go into the dictionary and doesn't have a ready English translation, but it can be translated using notions like belonging to the same tribe, to the same house, and so forth. People also, I notice, will use it to translate.
Would you be closer to the same clan?
Pardon?
Clan?
Clan, yeah.
Closer than tribe?
Well, I was using the word tribe there to mean what, as a translation for deh. Yeah, so clan and tribe be the same. But I know some people will translate this as company, but basically it's an organized social group. An organized social group. Okay, so we're doing a bit of suppletion. How about when one person dies? No. No, it's cat. Hard N. Now, is it nu or nu? Short vowel. And it ends in a hard W. Nu. You can test it. Nu-wa. Nu-wa. You know, did he die? Or did she die? Nu. Nu. Okay, now what's the plural of nu? Dach or dech or dedech, where it's, there is a reduplication there, the way we're getting it. But you see, dech or dedech doesn't look at all like nu. And I'll do one more, and then I want to change the pace and move to some different material, because I think we've done enough grammar for the day. How about ski? Ski. To be in a lying position, to be stationary, to lie, not in the sense of yell or beak, but in the sense of, you know, to be lying on something. You can say something ski. What's the plural of ski? Doch. Doch. Okay, well, just to wrap this up, the grammar part, suppletion is found in probably no more than 50 or so basic stem forms or stem pairs in the language, but those are extremely common words, nouns that are very high frequency or verbs that are very high frequency, and these will present problems for language learners. I would say, and these are where, in my observation, that young people often will make mistakes. Like in that pair of kek and hoot, I have heard younger people, instead of using hoot, they will say kikek. Or I've heard younger people say hoot for one person and then hoo-hoot for plurals. See, what they're doing is they're regularizing, they're making the language more regular, but because the speech community is not functioning 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, like it did 100 years ago, they don't hear the correct forms, or perhaps people around them don't correct them, and they'll use those new forms. But I would say in preparing teaching material for little kids, you don't want to tell them about suppletion. You'll really confuse. But in your materials, you have in your materials you have lots of examples of ski and doch, of mach and tet, so that from the materials, from hearing it, from reading it, they'll get it correctly, and they'll acquire the full language in all of its complexity, rather than reinventing it in a simplified baby talk sort of form. Also, some of these forms will differ from dialect to dialect. So, for example, we have yeah to go singular, but there are many people, and for many people, the plural will be either wilchs or willachs, like this. But there are some people who have schlop, schlop. And again, you need to learn, to learn what these different ways are. Now to talk to you about a topic which I would, if I were teaching a university class, I would call it sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics, and it has to do with the study of language, not in terms of its formal structure, its grammar and so forth, but language in society. Language in society. What different kinds of languages they are, how people use different kinds of language, what's the relationship between a dialect and a language, what is a language, how do we know where one language ends and another one begins, what is a standard language, what's a non-standard language, and these are all questions, or these are all concepts that will be of, not simply of interest, but of relevance to us, working together to develop teaching materials and a dictionary, to write the language down, to record it in all of its fullness and glory. Let me start by just giving a broad general picture. How many languages are there in the world today? How many languages? Well, there are people who actually count languages. One of the outfits that does it are the people who are known as the Summer Institute of Linguistics, or SIL. They also, that's their technical arm, but they are also known as the Wycliffe Bible translators. The Wycliffe Bible translators, because they train people as linguists to go out and to translate the Bible into indigenous languages. So, for example, the Braithwaites, who years ago were at Skeena Crossing, were sent there to do that, but they, for various reasons, didn't accomplish the job. But the SIL and Wycliffe, every few years, put out a book called the Ethnologue, where they actually try to list all the different languages of the world and where they're located. By their count and by other counts, we reckon that there are at least 5,000 languages, 5,000 separate languages spoken in the world. To give you, different parts of the world will vary in terms of how many different languages are spoken there. This right now, 1992, is the 500th anniversary of Columbus, quote, discovering the New World. He didn't recognize that, you know, there were people already here. But what I'm getting at is that with Columbus' voyage to, quote, the New World, there came European colonization, that Western Europeans began to spread themselves into the Americas and also into India, then later to Africa and to Australia and so forth. And we know that lots of languages, lots of different people have died out as a result of that. So that 500 years ago, there probably were considerably more than 5,000 languages. No, that would be just the individual languages. The question is that the language families? No, there's a smaller number of language families because some languages belong to the same family. So there are fewer families than languages. But before 500 years ago, we believe, when I say we, I mean anthropologists and historians and demographers. Demographers are people who study population, and people who've looked at the earliest written records and oral histories and so forth, believe that in North America, Central America, and South America, there were something like 2,000 separate languages, 2,000 separate languages, indigenous languages, languages spoken by Indian people, people whom Europeans gave that name Indian, because in the old days you had your own distinctive names for each other, as well as calling yourself simply people or human beings there. But of these, there were 1,000 languages in what we call South America. There were 750 languages in Central America. Central America, and in North America, that is north of the Mexican boundary and what is today the United States and Canada, there were something like 250 separate languages. Today, of these 250 languages that were spoken 500 years ago in the area of current United States and Canada, no more than half of those, no more than 125 are still spoken. This sort of linguicide, if you want to call it that, the processes that brought about the extinction of languages is directly related to European settlement and colonization, to the effects of epidemic disease, as well as to dispossession and just outright killing and murder and war. We didn't have quite that here, but there are many parts of North America where people, you know, fought with the incoming settlers and were actually killed. This happened, by the way, most places where Europeans settled in numbers. In Australia, my home now, there were something like 250 to 300 languages 200 years ago when the white people first came. There's just over 100 left now, and it's a direct result of European colonization. In the province of British Columbia, which is a province that has considerable linguistic diversity, there were at least 30, perhaps as many as 50 separate languages spoken, so that British Columbia is an area that had lots of different languages. My home state of Queensland in Australia had 90 separate Aboriginal languages, but less than half of those survive today. Of these surviving North American languages, the strongest language in terms of number of speakers is a language spoken down in New Mexico and Arizona, which is called Navajo. And it has over 120,000 speakers, but it too is in a situation where many children are no longer learning it as a first language, so that even though it's, in terms of the number of speakers, is the healthiest language, it's still its speech community that's not in good shape, and they too are, well, they have bilingual schooling and so forth. In fact, there are even Navajo PhDs in linguistics and education. There'd be at least a half dozen Navajo people who have their PhD degrees and read and write their language and use it. And it varies then from languages like Navajo to, there would be probably 8,000 to 10,000 people, Gitksan people, but I would estimate of, the total number of Gitksan people, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 speak the language really well, perhaps even less than that, right down to a language that's spoken in Clem 2 by the Nislos family, which they call, well, it's written this way, Skurks. It's closely related to Tsimsanam, but it's a separate language. It's a separate language. In Tsimsanam, the word for bone is shipe. Our word is sip. In the sky say tip. In Skurks they say shipe. It's pronounced like this, T front X A Y P, shipe. And it has no more than 6 or 7 people know it, and only 3 or 4 of them speak it reasonably well. And thank goodness it's being recorded now, but whether they'll be able to repair the damage and keep it going, I don't know. And as well, there are languages like I work with people down in eastern Oregon who call themselves, they're called in English Cayuse, they call themselves Wiyilitpu. There's nobody talks their original language. Cayuse people, if they talk an Indian language, they all talk English, but if they talk an indigenous language, it's either Nez Perce or Sahaptin. They shifted, they lost their own language 100 years or so ago, but probably in part had to do with contact with white people. So those are some figures to give you some idea of the language situation of indigenous languages in the New World and in the world as a whole. I say there's something like 5,000. Again, a bit more comparative material. Just north of Australia had like 250 languages, but just north of Australia looking something like this, is this island right here of New Guinea and adjacent islands out here. There are 1,250 different languages. 20%, more than 20% of the world's languages are spoken on the big island of New Guinea, and something like 2,000 languages in New Guinea and the adjacent islands there. But to come back again to give a bit of historical perspective, as I said, 500 years ago, there were 2,000 indigenous languages in the New World, and there's only half that number today as a result of language loss, of language death. Well, just as there have been languages that have been losing speakers, losing speakers and even dying out, so too there have been languages that have been gaining speakers. Navajo actually is a case in point. In 1860, there were something like 5,000 Navajo. And, you know, there's more Navajo now than ever before. But that's really the exception. You know, in most cases, there are indigenous groups are only just now rebuilding to their previous numbers. But the English language, which I'm using, or which we're using in here for the lectures and teaching, 500 years ago, English had just several million speakers, and its position in Western Europe was not particularly strong. When the English went overseas, when the English king sent diplomats to Paris or to Rome or to the German capitals and so forth, they couldn't expect to speak English. They had to speak French or Latin or German or the language of the country they went to. English was the language of a geographically marginal, small island nation. But by virtue of, you know, a number of technological advances and new forms of social organization, the English, or people speaking English, you know, spread their language to others and began to move around the world and to colonize other places. So that today, English is the most widely spoken language throughout the world. 500 years ago, it had maybe 3 million speakers restricted to the British Isles. 1992, it has probably 700 million speakers around the world. It's the most widely spoken language in the world. And de facto, we might speak of it as being the world language. And there are other languages that have similarly grown over the years. I also want to say, before moving on to my next point, that when we count the number of languages in the world, you shouldn't think of the world as being divided up into people who speak English and people who speak French and people who speak German and who speak Somalian and so forth like that, as though each people speaks only one language, or that people in a particular area speak only one language. For most of the world today, people are at least bilingual. That is, most human beings today speak at least 2 languages or understand 2 languages, or many people are, to use the more general term, are multilingual. And I would venture to say that throughout human history, that most human beings have probably spoken more than one language. The sort of monolingualism we find in the English-speaking countries like Canada and America, Australia, where monolingualism is seen as being normal and as the ideal, that's really the exceptional case in human history, and it's the exceptional case today. And unfortunately, there's a lot of bad pedagogy goes with it. There's the notion that you have only so much capacity for language, so if you spread that capacity over 2 languages, it's you're set to grow up with, you know, not having either semilingual. You don't have them fully. That is a bunch of nonsense. And I say that not simply from my own experience, but from a lot of good, hard research around the world, that in fact it's quite possible for humans to be fully fluent, fully competent in more than one language. What's important in gaining that is that you have the opportunity to learn the languages, particularly when you're young, and to learn them under conditions of positive evaluation, where the languages are positively valued. If you have a situation where one or more languages is stigmatized, like, say, mainstream Siwa have this notion that, you know, there's only one Indian language and it's simple and primitive and so forth. Well, children will absorb that, or if you, you know, if you have your mouth washed out of soap at residential school for talking your own language, well, children quickly, subconsciously learn to try to avoid those situations, and it interrupts normal language learning. But multilingualism is the general case in the world. And just one last thing before moving on. Where I work in Australia, up in the extreme northeast of Australia, up near just within 500 miles of New Guinea, a place called Cape York Peninsula. The old Aboriginal people who started teaching me language there 20 years ago and who are all dead now, they all spoke 3 or 4 languages straight through, as they say, and most could understand another 3 or 4. They would, for many of them, they would be the equivalent of well-traveled European aristocrats in the last century who know English, French, German, and so forth. Your own old people, when I first came here, I've heard of chiefs and Sigademanak, particularly the high-ranked people who would know Tsimsanamk, knew the coast language. Sometimes they knew Haidach, also knew Silmamach, and then later when the Omksiwa came, they learned English, maybe learned Chinook, but they too were multilingual people. It's multilingualism is part of being human in most cases. Okay, I said there's about 5,000 languages altogether around the world, and I still haven't said how we decide where one language ends and another one begins. But of the 5,000 languages around the world, there's a small number of languages that belong to a category which I will call national standard languages. And I'll abbreviate language as just LG, or LGS for national standard languages. There's more than 50, but less than 100 national standard languages. And national standard languages have certain properties, certain features of the language itself or the speech community we can talk about. First of all, a national standard language has official status, generally recognized by law within a country. When I say within a country, I mean a modern state, you know, which has a parliament or a politburo or whatever, but a state-organized society. National standard languages have official status. Canada is a country that has constitutionally now 2 national standard languages, which are English and French. The United States, the official language there is English, but increasingly it's challenged. And for example, I lived in the state of New Mexico for a number of years, where the state of New Mexico had 2 official languages, English and Spanish, so that all the government forms, the goods that you bought in the grocery were both in English and Spanish, the way you find labels are in English and French here. But a national standard language has official status within a state. Can be de jure, you know, written into the Constitution or a matter of legislation, or it can be de facto a matter of custom. Second, national standard language is used in the public life of the country. Used in the public life of a country. It's used in the government and in the courts, used in the performing arts, you know, drama, and so forth, movies, used in the sciences. Third, national standard languages always have a written literature. A written literature. And that written literature may include older works, you know, several hundred years old, things like religious literature, but the written literature will vary between you know, things like short stories, novels, poetry, what in French are called belles lettres, you know, creative writing, to the technical writing of education and science, and increasingly important for national standard languages in modern states, language used for advertising, you know, both written and spoken. You use the standard language. Fourth feature about national standard languages is that they have codified or codified norms. Codified or codified norms. That is, codified simply means that these have been gathered together, systematized, written down. But national standard languages, there are always written grammars available, which you can go to, and you've used them, you know, had them as textbooks. There are always dictionaries, at least one dictionary you can go to, and you can find out what a word means or how to spell it, or what its origins are, that sort of thing. And these are not only codified, but they're formalized too. They're set down on paper where they have a life, they begin to take on a life of their own. Codified norms then. And fifthly, standard languages are typically learned as a second, well, I won't say learned as a second language. Standard languages typically are taught, well, they're used as a medium of instruction, and they also are the object of instruction. They're used as mediums of instruction, so you go into school and they teach you in English, in standard English or in standard French, but they also are themselves objects of instruction, so that you have classes in English where you learn about nouns and verbs, and you learn how to spell and how to read, how to write, so forth. So that they are typically acquired through formal learning, through formal instruction. So they're not simply mediums of instruction, but they become objects of instruction.